Joining us now from Philadelphia, where he heads the fourth largest police department in the United States, is Commissioner Charles Ramsey. Commissioner, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Recently, over the last few months, police in the United States have been in the news for all the wrong reasons. Let's look at one aspect why they've been in the news. That report that we saw at the beginning of the program. We've seen many reports of fines being levied on mostly black people to boost government revenues. Take the town of Ferguson, for instance, which was mentioned in that report. Fines will bring in $3.1 million this year. That will be about 25% of that city's budget. As Mother Jones magazine points out, almost all of that money is extracted from the city's poorest African-American citizens. Is this what police should be doing, becoming effectively tax collectors for a city?
Well, police shouldn't be tax collectors. One of the recommendations in the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing makes reference to that sort of activity. However, police do execute lawful orders from the court, and warrants are lawful orders from a court. So if you want to fix that particular problem, it has to happen at a level much higher than the police. Because once a warrant is issued and we're charged with the responsibility of executing that warrant, then, you let the cards fall where they may. So if there are changes that need to be made at the local or state level, then our legislators, our elected officials need to take the steps to do it, and the courts need to be involved.
Right, you make a great point there. According to the Washington Post, though, your group was charged with telling local and state governments how to appropriately enforce their laws in a period when, as we all know, there is growing civil unrest in this country. So how do you address that?
Well, you have to take it a step at a time, and you have to take a look at the issues that are having a negative impact. There's a balance there. People just can't do whatever they want to do, and there be no consequences at all. But at what point in time is it becoming excessive? And each jurisdiction, each community has to kind of decide that for themselves. One of the issues raised in your piece was speeding. Well, a lot of the auto accidents and fatalities are a result of speeding. That's no small thing. But there are some issues and there are some fines being imposed upon people for relatively minor things. And if that's something that a jurisdiction no longer wants to do, then they should take the appropriate steps to do it. Unfortunately, the burden falls on police because we're the ones that ultimately are the ones that execute the court order.
What do you make of the fact, according to the Justice Department report, that 96% of those arrested for outstanding warrants were African Americans?
Well, if the warrants were issued in that fashion, when we get a warrant, we get a warrant. We're not looking at the race of the individual other than an identifier for the suspect that we have to try to take into custody. But the courts are the ones issuing these particular orders or warrants. And so depending on the racial makeup of the community, depending on the kinds of issues that are involved, sometimes it is concentrated in some communities more so than in other communities. It should not be done on a biased basis, however. It should be across the board, fair and impartial.
That Justice Department report that I referred to referenced a lady who received 2 parking tickets totaling $151. Her payments fell behind. She couldn't afford it. She eventually paid out $500. At one point, she was incarcerated for non-payment. 8 years later, she still owes $541 in accrued fees. There's something seriously wrong here, isn't there?
Well, there may be something wrong there, but again, is that the police or is that the way the laws are written, the way fines are imposed against individuals? Listen, if a city wants to just ignore it, reduce the cost. One of your, I forget who it was on the piece, said that they could reduce the cost. There are other jurisdictions that periodically have amnesty in the sense of really reducing any kind of additional fines, penalties, things of that nature, cut it in half. There are a variety of ways in which you can address it, but the bottom line is each community has to decide what laws do they want and what laws should be on the books. And if it's a law that shouldn't be on the books, then take it off. But police don't do that. We simply follow the direction that's laid out by the courts. And if they issue a warrant, then we execute the warrant.
I want to ask you about something else, another police tactic which has received enormous publicity here in the United States as well as around the world, and that is the tactic known as stop and frisk. In the first quarter of this year, according to the New York Civil Liberties Union, more than 80% of those stopped were black or Latino, and that was particularly in New York. Is that something that you support?
The reality is we have a lot of violence in our communities, and there are some circumstances where an officer is justified in stopping an individual and then patting them down for weapons for their own protection. I mean, you know, some of our communities, we have a lot of gun violence occurring in our communities. I've been police chief in Philadelphia for 7.5 years. I have 8 officers that have been killed in the line of duty, 5 of whom were shot to death by suspects. So we have to have the right balance. We have to operate within the constitutional framework. Stopping and frisking people without reasonable suspicion is just flat out wrong. But if the circumstances are such that would justify and warrant such a search, then police officers ought to be able to do that. And for those elected officials that are crying about stopping it entirely, in my opinion, are making a huge mistake. They should be focused on making sure that these stops are being done in a constitutional manner, I should say.
Right.
And not just throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Right. There should be probable cause, as you point out, but there have been so many egregious examples of people being stopped where there was no reason for them to be stopped. I was looking at 2 examples here. One was a man being arrested in New York for obstructing the sidewalk. What he was really doing was smoking a cigarette outside his apartment building at 1 a.m. in the morning. There was nobody else on the street, but he was arrested for obstructing a sidewalk. Another instance, which was reported just this past weekend by the New York Times, a man was arrested for carrying drug paraphernalia. He happened to have a straw, which he was using to drink a soft drink. That all fell under the ambit of stop and frisk.
Well, listen, if there are illegal stops, then deal with that particular officer, and there should be some discipline imposed. But to get rid of the ability for an officer with reasonable suspicion, which is a standard slightly lower than probable cause, but with reasonable suspicion, doing it within constitutional guidelines. These are not examples that I would think would warrant throwing out Terry stops. I mean, we need to be able to still deal with the real violence taking place on our city. We need to be able to make sure our officers are protected, but at the same time, if officers are abusing their authority in any way at all, they need to be dealt with very swiftly and very decisively. I mean, we have almost 800,000 law enforcement officers in the United States. I mean, you can always cite 2 or 3 examples, or 10 or 20 or 100 examples, but we have millions of contacts that take place on a regular basis throughout the United States, the vast majority of which are done properly.
But isn't the problem here, it is those examples that cause mistrust between police and their local communities. I mean, you've been a police officer.
Sure.
For decades. You are one of the most senior police officers in the United States. Don't the police and authorities have a huge job in this country of building trust between police and local communities?
It's an enormous challenge for us. That's the very first pillar in our task force report. And I'm not trying to justify bad searches, but one way of gaining trust is by taking strong, decisive action against those officers that abuse their authority, that operate outside the law. That doesn't mean that you change the law. It just means you deal with those that abuse it. Because you also can't ignore the reality of the number of murders that we have throughout the United States, particularly in cities like Philadelphia and Chicago and others where we have concentrated pockets of violence, and we have to find a way in order to effectively deal with it, but deal with it in a way that keeps us within a constitutional framework. That really has to be the focus.
Commissioner Charles Ramsey, thanks for joining us, sir.